So, Dan, I'm super pumped to be talking to you about this topic about what happens with rent control when rent control comes to your area, the good, bad, all of the in between. I know you've got a story. You are in the real estate industry, you're investing, you are running a property management company, and you've seen this thing happen in a city where you're at. And I just love for you to share some of that with us. And again, guys, this is Dan Hayes, real property management in Portland, Oregon, and real estate investor.
Chris, it's really good to talk with you. I always enjoy our conversations. So I'm happy to share with you what happened to us. So I'll start with where we're at today. So where we're at today is the nation's first state to have statewide rent control. And that's what's most uncommon about what we have, is that the rent control that we have is statewide. And that's normally not what you see. In fact, again, we were the first state to have statewide rent control. Now, California has tried to pass that a couple of times and it's failed, which is good news. So what I think is super important is to at first really watch what's happening in your city councils, because that's where it started for us too. So what happened to us is we come out of this recession, the Great Recession, not enough supply, very popular place to live in Portland Metro, and we start seeing rents spike big time. And that wasn't as much of a problem as it was the way in which landlords and investors were taking rent increases. What we saw were developers came in and would literally evict the entire apartment complex, renovate it, and get it to market rents, which were substantially higher than what they were before they bought it. And that's not uncommon, but when it starts happening a ton, that's when your city officials start hearing from their constituency, like, I'm being displaced. The second thing that happened is if they didn't displace the tenant, we started to see landlords raising rents multiple times per year. So we started to see, I'm up 5%. Then they come back 2 months later and raise the rent again. And they come back a few months later and raise the rent again. And those of us in the industry really tried to get the industry to pay attention to what was happening and say, look, we need to calm this down, because if we don't self-govern, we're going to be governed. And because we are so fractured as an industry, we weren't able to do that, regardless of what association call outs that were around. Make sure you're moderating, raise your rent once a year, keep raising rents, don't do a huge jump all at once, etc. So what happened is we had a mayor change. Ted Wheeler became mayor, and a city council member named Chloe Daly ran on a platform of tenant protection, and she beat a guy named Novak who was running for re-election. And in Portland, Oregon, to have a city council member lose their re-election bid is very rare. So it was big news that Chloe Daly came in and beat this Novak guy. And she again ran on a platform of tenant protection. Now that was in 2016. And at that time, Portland was under a housing emergency. So the previous mayor, Hale, declared a housing emergency. And that's warning sign number one, is that the mayor or the city council declares a housing emergency. Now for us, what that meant was your homeless population were allowed to camp overnight on public property. That's where it began for Portland. If you were to see Portland, it's one big giant homeless camp. We're still, since 2015, under that housing emergency, which allows homeless to sleep on public property. And it had a bunch of other things associated with that, but that was the most pronounced thing. Hale lost re-election, Wheeler came in, Udaly won, and in February of 2017, they proposed Portland's first major tenant protection called Portland's relocation requirement. Now, most states have rent control as illegal, and Oregon did at the same time. In the 80s, a lot of states put into their constitution or made rent control legal. In 2016, that was the case in Oregon. So Portland came out with a proposal not to control rent, but to require landlords to pay a relocation fee if one of two triggers were met. Trigger number one, you raise the rent 10% or more, and the tenant requested a relocation payment. In other words, said they couldn't afford the rent increase. If that happened, a landlord paid a relocation payment. Trigger number 2 was if you ended the tenancy without cause, didn't have a tenant reason, no major lease violation, you just ended the tenancy like we landlords normally do. If you do that, you would pay a relocation payment. The relocation payments were determined on number of bedroom size, a really blunt instrument. But basically, if you raised the rent 10% or more or ended the tenancy without cause, a relocation payment was made by the landlord. Of course, we all sued, but the city of Portland contended that it wasn't rent control. You can raise the rent as much as you want. You can end the tenancy if you want. No one's telling you you can't. But if you do, we're going to make you pay a relocation payment. That was the first big piece of legislation in the city that we landlords knew something was up. They tried to get rent control passed in the next legislative session, but they made a mistake. Number one, it came out of the House, which had a supermajority on the left, not a supermajority in the Senate. Their mistake was they tried to remove the prohibition on rent control from cities and counties, such that cities and counties could adopt rent control. That did not make it out of the Senate Rules Committee. Everybody was nervous about radical left Portland going absolutely nuts, which really would have happened. So it didn't make it out of that legislative session. The next legislative session, what happened is they took a run at it at a statewide level. And that's really the next big warning sign is if you start to hear chatter that they're going to establish housing as a statewide concern. So that's the very first step that they had to take is the state declared housing as a statewide concern, made rent control statewide, left the prohibition on cities and counties. So even in Oregon today, a city or a county cannot adopt rent control. Only the state can do that, and it does, okay? Now, what you're gonna watch out for and what's gonna happen is everybody's gonna be concerned about that, what they call strict or San Francisco style rent control. That's not the threat. Now, San Francisco style rent control is when some government agency says you can only raise the rent this much, that's it, period, no matter what, between tenancies, during tenancies, etc. What they'll propose likely, and it's actually pretty benign even in Oregon, is what they call next generation rent control. You'll recognize it by 3 things. Number 1, you'll be able to raise the rent between tenancies, okay? That's signal number 1. Signal number 2 will be that they'll exclude some piece of the marketplace so that they don't scare away investors. And that's really what they tell all these developers, like, you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about rent control because you'll be excluded for 15 years or whatever. So in Oregon, the second thing they did is they said, if your initial certificate of occupancy is less than 15 years old, you're not subject to the rent control piece of rent control. And that's one of the reasons why I've been building units is because I want a certain percentage of my revenue not to be under rent control in case hyperinflation does occur. And so I've got about 50% of my revenue now with buildings that have a certificate of occupancy less than 15 years. So they tell developers, you have 15 years not to worry about it. And when you look, and they had some expert come in and say, look at investors, they only hold their properties between 10 and 15 years and then they sell them. So you're not going to lose investors if you do this. Well, that's not what happened. They did lose investors. But that's the second thing. The third thing that they'll do is they'll tie it to inflation. So they have a base amount plus inflation. So here, our rent control gets established every September, and it's 7% plus consumer price index as established by the U.S. Labor Census Bureau. So for 2021, it's 9.2. In September, they'll reset it, and it'll be 7% plus inflation. Now, as a rental property owner, if I could raise every one of my rental properties 9.2% a year, you and I wouldn't be on this call. I'd be in Mexico full time because I'd be retired. But that's not how life works. How life works, of course, is that we don't raise the rent or we make modest increases until the market moves. And when the market moves, we move with it. So the rent control piece of rent control, next generation, doesn't do a lot. So it doesn't do much to actually control rent because you can raise it up that it's pretty liberal and you can raise it between tenancies. So that's actually that's not the rent control to get too worried about, to be honest with you. In fact, I just updated my rental update for a class that I'm doing, and I'm seeing year-to-date rent increases in Hillsborough, 16%, Lake Oswego, 13%. I mean, well above the allowable rent amount. And that's because you can raise it between tenancies, which is where most landlords raise their rent, right? Here's what you really want to watch out for. And this is where the fight is absolutely worth every dollar that you need to spend to fight it. And that is going to be, and by the way, it'll be the part of rent control that the press doesn't talk about. So when we were going through it and you'd read the news stories, all they would talk about in the media was about the rent control piece of rent control. They never really mentioned the second part, which is actually the most difficult part. And that's the restriction on a landlord to raise the rent, or excuse me, a restriction on the landlord to end the tenancy without cause. So this will blow your mind. In Oregon, a landlord can end the tenancy without cause if the tenants have not lived in the property for a year or more and their tenancy agreement allows them to do so. So in other words, month to month, or the fixed term lease agreement is coming to its end and it hasn't been a year yet and it's their initial lease term. Once the tenants live in the property, regardless of your agreement type, fixed term or month to month, once the tenants live in the property for a year or more to the day, a landlord can no longer end their tenancy without cause. You now have to meet one of 5 landlord qualifying reasons. And if you don't pay a there's no relocation fee that you can pay. There's just no ending the tenancy. So I mentioned that I've got that house. I want to tear it down. I want to build 2 more duplexes. Those tenants have lived in that property for 2 years. I cannot, and they're on month to month, I cannot simply end their tenancy. I have to meet a landlord qualifying reason, right? And so the landlord qualifyings in our state are, you want to convert the use to something other than residential. You want to demolish the unit, which I do, but I have to have a permit first. And I can't get a permit until it's vacant. It's the craziest thing. The third reason is you want to repair, remodel, or renovate the unit to the degree that it's unfit or unsafe to live in. And then the fourth is you or an immediate family member want to move back into it, or you sell it to someone who intends to live in the property as their primary residence. And if you don't have those, you're not getting anybody out. So it stopped these developers from coming in and saying, hey, we're going to freshen up the unit, everybody out. Then they do that and jack their rents up to market. Those days are over. And in Portland, Oregon, anytime you end the tenancy without cause or as a result of one of those landlord qualifying reasons, you're going to pay a relocation fee. I'm working with a developer right now. We are setting aside $75,000 in relocation fees to do that project. Mm-hmm. Now, what do you think happens to the cost of doing business in Portland, Oregon? When you put that
Oh, smokes. That was one of my questions, Dan, is you continually said the relocation fee. Mm-hmm. Is that a set fee in Oregon or statewide, or is it arbitrary as to, maybe they lived in an expensive rental, so their relocation is going to be more? What is that?
You're giving politicians too much credit, Chris. There's not that much analysis that goes into it. It's literally a blunt instrument. So in Oregon, statewide rent control, if that landlord ends the tenancy as a result of one of those landlord qualifying reasons, and the landlord owns or has partial ownership in 4 or more units anywhere, not just in Oregon, but anywhere, that landlord will pay an amount equal to 1 month's rent in relocation fee at the time you serve the notice to vacate. The city of Portland has gone further and said it's not 1 month, it's an average of the monthly rent for the number of bedrooms in the unit. So it's blunt instrument. Studio, $2,900. One bedroom, $3,200. Two bedroom, $4,200. Three bedroom or more, $4,500. Doesn't matter how much money they make. It doesn't matter how what the rent is. It's literally in their brain a calculation of first, last, and security deposit amount to help that tenant move.
Wow. So what are you guys seeing from the management side with landlords? Like, how are they adjusting to this? Because I think as a landlord, one of the strategies as a landlord sometimes is to rent a house under market value to a tenant who takes really good care of the property. But it sounds like in a situation like this, that could really come back to haunt the landlord when that tenant either moves on, chooses, another place to live, passes, what have you. Talk to me about a situation like that.
So one of the things we said to the city council, and I've had a chance to testify at each one of these meetings over the years, and what we said, many of us, myself included, said, look, what you don't understand is landlords, independent landlords, have a tendency to provide affordable housing by way of lower rents versus market to reward a great tenant, because nobody wants a bad tenant. And we landlords, the worst thing that can happen is that it's vacant. So we hold on to these tenants like nobody's business. And we often do that through rent. Those days are going to go away. And in fact, that's exactly what's happened. The subsidy that naturally occurs through an independent landlord by rewarding good tenants is gone. I mean, it literally it was 2017, so we're 4 years now, 5 years nearly in. You rarely now see units that are significantly below market. Where I do see them are landlords that have been raising the rent 9%, 10%, whatever it is, and they're literally years away from being at market. I did an analysis for an investor the other day. This guy had a duplex, both of his units. One was 6 years, the other was 8 years away. At maximum rent increase allowable by the state to get to market.
From the current market.
To current market. Didn't even factor a 3 to 5% appreciation each year. I did an analysis for a 40-unit apartment complex a year and a half ago. And I calculated that they gave up around $500,000 in value based on a market cap rate. And they were unable to they couldn't get rid of that market valuation because rent control would take too long for them to get market rents. And so you see a real devaluing of multifamily properties.
Wow.
And I work with a number of brokers like you do. And one of them, we talk all the time about, long-term landlords cannot sell their multifamily because they're so far below market, and the buyer can't do anything about it unless a major remodel is going to take place. Yeah, it's destructive in that way too.
Did you see in the Portland market, did you see wages or minimum wage or just higher income earning jobs? Did you see that starting to take place at any type of scale that then trickled into the housing and the rents and then kind of led into this? Like, did you see anything like that?
No, I think, because we were pretty new in the business when, we were about a year and a half in when this really started to heat up. So we didn't have a lot of history before that. But what we did see was rent prices escalating well above wage. Okay. And we saw a lot of displacement that took place as a result. We then saw households combining at a much more rapid rate than before. And that's really what we saw as a result. Now what we see, and by the way, what we also saw over the last several years is a high level of studio and one-bedroom apartments, because those are the only ones that pencil out in a rent control world. So in fact, I was looking at some data. Half of the rental units in Portland are one bedroom or less. Half of the rental units in Portland are one bedroom or less, which makes rent more expensive on a per square foot basis, as we know, right? So not enough inventory in 2-bedroom and 3 bedrooms above because they just don't pencil, and it's easier for a developer to get the return. The other thing that the city of Portland did in a very short-sighted manner, the next year after they got the relocation payment approved, this is another thing to watch out for, is any talk around inclusionary zoning. So in 2018, the city of Portland passed inclusionary zoning requirements, and we all said, don't do that. Inclusionary zoning means that a developer has to set aside a certain number of units and make them affordable relative to the median family income, okay? So in Portland, if a developer wants to build 20 units or more, that developer must set aside 20% of the units and rent them at a certain percentage of median family income for the household size. What do you suppose happened? Number one, 70% drop off in permits post-inclusionary zoning. 70% drop off in permits for new construction, residential multifamily construction, the next year. Secondly, most units that are being built, 19 units or less. So what do you suppose happens to supply? Exactly what we're going through. It's going down. And some people ask me, why do you remain in Portland, Dan, with so much chaos, civil unrest, and relocation requirements? Here's why. I get calls every day from somebody wanting to know how to sell a tenant-occupied property. And it's an independent landlord who wants out. We are significantly reducing the supply of rental properties available. Wow. And we still have demand. And sure enough, man, you're starting to see rent increases now post-pandemic that honestly have me worried. Because what's going to stop them from just taking 7% and making it 5%, then making it 4%, then making it 2%?
Right, right. So just out of curiosity, what's the minimum wage in Portland? Any idea?
On its way to 15.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know what your frontline folks, what you pay frontline folks, but in Portland, Oregon, we can't get an entry-level person for less than $18 an hour.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Wow. We're seeing our entry-level staff. It's escalating. What it once was is no longer, they've already put in all of our legislation that our minimum wage is going up to, I think it's $12.50, and they've escalated it over a few years, but it's already having an impact. And when we're seeing, I just saw one closed on a property, and it was Housing Choice Voucher Program, Section 8. And Section 8 was paying $850 a month for this 2-bedroom place. And the previous landlord served a notice to terminate. Section 8 came back and said, we'll pay $1,250 for that same rental unit. The problem is the going market rent is right at $1,500 now. So, I mean, it's just really interesting to see that just here in our local market. And that's why it was so exciting to me to get on a call with you, because you've gone through this, you've seen it firsthand, you've lived it, dealt with all the legislation, and argued on behalf of landlords for years now. Is there anything that can be done once rent control is in place? Is there any getting rid of it? Has there ever been a case of getting rid of it?
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah, we're done. I mean, the only thing that's happened is that landlord association led by an attorney who's a pretty famous landlord attorney here, John DiLorenzo, sued the city of Portland based on their relocation payment, alleging that it's just hidden rent control, which it is. And that has made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And they heard that case, the Oregon Supreme Court heard that case this summer. So we're expecting to see what the ruling is in the fall. So we're going to see what happens, but there's no getting rid of statewide rent control. It is here to stay. There's no question about it in my mind. And you have to learn how to work around it. So what you get is you get less people who are willing to engage in the rental market as accidental landlords because they don't want to deal with it. But we purposeful investors, because if you think about it, the reasons why a landlord would end the tenancy, I have no problem with that. I'm a buy and hold investor. So I'm not going to make you leave unless you do something wrong anyway. So that part doesn't bother me as much as the destruction of the overall rental industry, because not everybody can handle that. And I'm just not a proponent of legislation like this where you don't let the market take its natural course and let competition do what competition does. And we are seeing an opposite effect to that. So I don't see any light at the end of the tunnel that says this is going to go away. My only hope is that they've battered landlords to the point that they back off on some of the other stuff, eliminating rent control, screening criteria mandates, et cetera, et cetera. So my advice would be this: don't underestimate how quickly this can happen to you. Watch your city councils in your major metro liberal markets. That is the first step that'll go, and then they'll see what happens. And then they'll get down to your state capital and try and make it happen statewide. But in a state like Oregon, where you have a major metro market, three of them, Portland, Eugene, and Bend, who drives the legislature in Salem, Oregon, not the rural Oregon, but those three cities, it only takes the city council of those three cities to adopt these things, and then they run down to Salem and try and get it done statewide. So I would say watch your city councils for sure, and fight like hell to keep the restriction off of landlords to end tenancies. It's incredibly destructive. It really does not allow landlords to manage the community. And yeah, there are landlords out there that are discriminatory and retaliatory. There are many mechanisms that can handle that, but eliminating a landlord's ability to end the tenancy without cause is very destructive. And if you're going to allow rent control to come in, if that's the give back, make sure it's tied to inflation for sure. Make sure it's a liberal base plus inflation, because that, for me, if and when hyperinflation hits, I can at least raise my rents to the point where I can keep up with inflation, versus the San Francisco style rent control, which is, every economist will tell you, is destructive to the industry and the economy itself.
So just a question, just to play devil's advocate here. Are there any good things that came out of rent control? Or
I think yeah, sorry to interrupt, but I think what it did do is, I've called it this. It's not necessarily rent control. It's probably anti-rent gouging control. So it stopped some of that bad behavior. And now what we're left with are kind of the unintended consequences, where you have a landlord. I met a landlord the other day who's got rent at $750 a month, and they could rent the place for $1,700 a month. Now, that doesn't serve that landlord well, and frankly, it doesn't serve that tenant well, because they have no idea what the real world's like, and it's not going to go well for them when he sells this property. So you do have that anti-gouging that takes place, but there are other ways to go about that. You know what I mean? That there are other ways to go about that. And they'll parade a whole bunch of examples of discrimination and retaliation, and there are other ways to deal with that in my mind. Education is one. I mean, hell, I've often advocated, this may sound crazy to you, but what drives me nuts is you've got to have a license to operate a boat in Oregon. You don't have to have any kind of education to be a landlord. None. Don't have to take any basic landlord tenant, fair housing classes. You don't have to demonstrate that you understand how to screen. You don't have to do anything like that. Yet, so we won't spend time teaching landlords how to be good landlords. And I talk to a lot of them just like you. Most of them just don't understand. They don't understand that they're being discriminatory. And they're making these moves that are just not very smart. Why not have an all-out education effort and require landlords to at least have a working knowledge of how this works? I'll do that. I'll spend money on that. I'll support that because it makes my life a lot easier. But that's what I think is important. Education. Don't let them take away your right to end the tenancy. And if they put rent control in place, don't let these individual cities have their way, because it'll be awful. Make the state do it, because you'll have enough of a balance politically, I think, to have some control there.
Are you seeing an argument, I guess, from the legislative slide where they're talking about, regentrification of neighborhoods, and that's the reason that maybe rent control is important. Like anything around that?
The government body didn't talk necessarily about gentrification as a reason, but they allowed their constituents to talk about the displacement to gentrify as the reason to do it. It's hard for a politician to say, hey, don't gentrify my neighborhood, because they love all the good things that come along with that, frankly. So they let that displaced family that's been in that neighborhood for 50 years get up and say, I don't have a place to live, as a means to say I don't want to gentrify.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, and that testimonial from the people who live there, that's powerful.
Yeah, and by the way, there are not enough landlords to balance that conversation.
Were there any groups that you were able to join forces with to help fight this? Like, talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we've got NARPM, but NARPM's so small they don't have much of a voice. What you really got to turn to is your largest multifamily association, and every state's got one. So here in the Pacific Northwest, we've got Multifamily Northwest, which we're a member of. 200,000 units in their membership. They're by far the biggest. But they're still even not big enough to make a huge difference. But you see the chair or the president of Multifamily Northwest in the news the most. What we tried to do, I tried to get the franchisor involved, very limited success there. But Bob Pifke at the time was somewhat helpful. But really what needs to happen is your real estate brokers that deal in multifamily need to join forces with the association like a Multifamily Northwest, then get your independent associations like Rental Housing Alliance of Oregon to join forces. Now it happened so fast to us, we couldn't coalesce. It was pretty far down the path before we got really together. And since then, we've had a much better effort to have a singular voice down in Salem, our state capital, as an industry. But what's happened is tenants and landlords who typically got together before legislation hit our state capital, that's broken down. They don't talk to each other anymore. So that's the other thing that happened, is that you had a real breakdown of these both sides of the issue coming together. But to shape good policy, they just hate each other now, and they won't talk to each other. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Just really interesting. Love hearing the story, and I think as a landlord, as business owner, this in the space that we're in. Property management, the rental market, this could happen anywhere. This is not just a, New York City, San Francisco, Portland thing. It could literally happen anywhere.
Yeah, and when you think about what's happening from a rent perspective, it's not those pricey West Coast, East Coast cities. In some cases, they're not even up above pre-pandemic levels. They're getting there. We're getting closer, but in some cases, our rents are still below pre-pandemic levels. But when you look at Toledo, Ohio, Boise, Charlotte, Chesapeake, those cities, that's what you want to watch. That's where the pain is. And that was a big surprise for everybody, is just how painful it was for people in rural Oregon. Nobody thought about it. But when you look at rural Oregon at the time, there was a lot of pain.
Wow.
Yeah.
So are there any good, resources or education that maybe you could share with us, we could go and look at?
Yeah, Grow Housing Together is one. I'll look at a couple, Chris, and I'll send them to you. I've got a couple of resources I still get. There's some really good stuff out there. I can't think at the top of my head, but I'll get that to you, okay? Because you definitely want to get them involved too, if you can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like you said, trying to join forces with the major multifamily players, NARPM, the real estate brokers, the realtor associations, try to get everybody playing from the same sheet of music, because instead of it being one-sided, maybe there could be some middle ground in it, if they're going to push it all the way through, the state level. So.
Yeah, I agree. Be careful with your real estate associations. They were almost silent. And now that when we do kind of peel it back, you can understand why. They knew that if this was passed, a lot of folks would get out of the business, and that's just transactions to them.
Interesting. Good insight there.
Always good to talk to you.
Dan, great talking to you, man. Appreciate your time as always. Much success to you.
All right, buddy.
Take care.